Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 112. My guest in this episode is Professor Richard A. Watson, and he is at the University of Southampton in the Institute for Life Sciences Department of Computer Science, Agents Interaction, and Complexity Group. And I've been enjoying being a casual student of Richard's work through Mike Levin's channel and Richard's own channel. And the reason I brought him on at this point in time, and he was wonderful and gracious to come on to my show, was he's teaching a course called Love and the Music of Life, and that'll be held Tuesdays in May, starting the 14th, 21st, 28th, and then into June 4th. And this course, the title or the subtitle is "Who Leads the Dance: The Evolution of Your Genes or the Song in Your Heart?" So, if that speaks to you and you like Richard's work and the collaboration he's done with Mike Levin and Mark Solms and Chris Fields, and he's spoken with Donald Hoffman, Ian McGilchrist, all these really cool guys. And if any of that resonates with you, I will have links in the description field for that course. That was the main drive for my getting him on at this time. And I will be having Richard back. This was a really long conversation, not really for my show, but it's fairly long, but it's worth it. Also, I'll be having him on, if the stars line up, I'll have him on with Matt Siegel too. So sorry this is so long-winded. I just wanted to get a lot of information in there. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed having him on my show, and I look forward to having him back. So, and thank you for being here. I appreciate that too. And I'd like to welcome Richard Watson to the IdeaCast interview series. I'm really looking forward to this because I've been binging on Professor Watson's work over the last, I don't know, a year or so. I guess you're frequently, when people say, "Oh yeah, I saw you through Michael," but you've had so many amazing conversations, and I refer to Michael Levin. So welcome. I'm glad to have you here as a guest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, for the invitation. Yeah, I've really been enjoying those conversations, and Mike Levin's introduced me to a whole bunch of interesting people, and it's been a fantastic journey. So I'm happy to talk to you today.
Good. Yeah, he's like an old Italian matchmaker or something. Oh, I've got someone for you. He probably wouldn't see it that way, but that's what I get out of it. He just brings these minds together and these conversations, and what emerges from that is so beautiful. And it speaks to, I think, some of the work that you do and talk about, which we were going to find out about in this conversation. I would like to do a sort of classic, almost cliche kind of start, and we'll get the audience to know you and find out a little bit about you, but we don't have to belabor it too much, because to the YouTube audience, first of all, welcome. I have curated a small list of interviews that if you want to, you don't have to stop this conversation and go watch them, but if you want to learn more, if we're whetting your appetite here, that'll be down below in the description field, as well as his channel, in which he has a series of uploads that speak to the work that he does, and it goes pretty deep. So as far as technical stature and content. So anyway, so Richard, I'm going to shush and let you talk. And yeah, let's get to know you for a bit, and then I want to talk about your upcoming course on the 14th of May.
Sure. Do you want me to start with a bit of background?
Well, yeah, I think let's talk about, you originally you were doing computer science, I think, and then you were asking some big questions, and how did that get you to where you are right now with what I would intuit is a driving force in your pursuits?
Yeah, I mean, so I was rather enamored with the idea of being able to do models of evolutionary processes inside a computer, which we call evolutionary algorithms or genetic algorithms, a number of decades ago. And over some years came to the position that that's not working. I can see that biological evolution produces the amazing, wondrous, endless forms most beautiful, but it's not happening in my computer simulation of that process. I wonder what's gone wrong there. Is it that my computer simulation doesn't implement the algorithm that Darwin described? Or is it that the algorithm that Darwin described doesn't describe what's actually happening in nature? And over the years, I've come to the conclusion that it's the latter, right? That evolution by natural selection, as Darwin described it, is true and correct in so much as it happens, but the claim that it explains the complexity and diversity of life that we observe is a different matter. And I don't think that it does. So I've been trying to understand a different way of understanding how living systems come to be as they are, and the role that living systems play in their own origination, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction to start with. And just a different way of thinking about things from the conventional, genes control everything and natural selection writes the script in the genes. That way of thinking about things just doesn't stand up. So we need a better way of understanding things technically. But then that also leads to, nothing's been more important no scientific theory's been more important in influencing who we think we are and what our role is in the universe than that theory. So if there's a different way of looking at things, there's potential there for that to change, what we think the meaning of life is, basically, and what our role in it is.
And is the current narrative of Darwinian evolution and the gene-centric thinking, is a stubborn artifact of sort of mid to late 19th century perspectives on how things were lensed back then, but much like physics, it's been sort of carried along, and at this kind of frame break that you're doing really hasn't. I don't know if there's been peer pressure not to do this, or what's holding and it's worked to a degree. I mean, we're doing stuff with CRISPR and things like that but as Michael Levin has demonstrated, that there's hardware and there's software and there's language and there's bricks, so this stubbornness, do you think there's a chance for a frame break on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's there are so many tightly gripped assumptions that are all interlocking. And it's really, really difficult to shift any of them whilst the others are in place. So it requires quite a considerable suspension of disbelief to even talk about it, to even talk about the fact that there's a problem, before you can begin to think about it, a different way of understanding it, a different way of understanding the processes. And it really goes all the way back to not just why is the way in which we think about living things in their evolution dogmatic. It's worse than that, because that way of thinking about living things in their evolution is the only conclusion that you could come to whilst you hold on to reductionism. Right? If you try to explain things by taking things apart and looking at the components that it's made out of and the interactions between them, you're bound to end up with Darwinian evolution and a bottom-up view of living systems. So if you want to do something different from that, you actually have to have a quite different a quite different approach to the science of living systems that isn't reductionist.
And I think physics, or the physical science, is grappling with this, and I think biology is sort of ensconced in that, again, that reductionist. It's not a layered ontology, but the reduction oriented, substance-based thinking, that, again, physics and physics has to do physics, but the philosophy of science that emerges, or the metaphysics that emerges from that, seems to, again, be struggling with this same locked in, tightly structured, I'll use a dogmatic word.
I don't want to speak to what, I'm not a historian of science, right? But physics does seem to be more willing or more eager to seek for revolutions or different framings or new ways of seeing things.
Okay.
We're gonna look inside the smallest things we can look inside, and then we're gonna look inside those, and then we're gonna look inside those. And then after a while you stop and think like, this isn't really working, right? And then you just do a whole complete different paradigm shift. Everything's a wave, right? Instead
Yeah.
of everything's a particle. Or what are we going to do about this wave particle duality? And, we need to dig deeper and find a different framework and a different way of looking at things. And evolutionary biology, conventional evolutionary biology, orthodox evolutionary biology is like, no, 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 no. We're not doing anything new. We're not doing anything different. We know how it works. Darwin told us how it works. We know that genes control everything. We know that natural selection wrote the script in the genes. And whatever isn't that is just details, right? But that is untouchable. And I think that adherence to not being willing to consider a different way of looking at things, that somewhat slavish attachment, or dare I say religious attachment to the orthodox view of living systems is a natural response, I think, to defending itself against a supernatural explanation of living things. Right? So you can't touch Darwin, and you can't touch Darwinian natural selection, and you can't touch a mechanistic reductionist view of how things work, because if you do, you're not a scientist.
Right. You're granting license to all kinds of buffoonery.
Yeah.
And I see that, but I also see it as a almost an asymmetrical false dilemma. It's like, yeah, you've got the theistic supernatural folks, but to me, that bracket that, and then again open up the idea that as you're doing and Mike is doing and a bunch of other folks, just to break frame and be novel and say, well, we've drilled down and we're down to, like you said, little wiggly things at the Planck scale, and then they vaporize, and then like you said, you got potential and things like that, and a new metaphysics or I don't know. I wouldn't know how to set that up, but yeah, it seems like it would be very bold and productive to entertain reasonable and sound things that can be tested or experimented with. Now, in talking about the sort of history of, say, Darwinistic or neo-Darwinism or wherever we are right now, is there a synthesis project there where we can extract away from some of these assumptions that are made, or some of the beliefs that are held on to, with again, the linearity of what their narrative is, the linearity in the sense of genes passing on genes is, I think you've said in other conversations that there are things that can be salvaged from that, or there is some, at some degree that can be implemented or modeled into maybe, again, a paradigmatic change. Is that, am I?
It is the case that genetic information is passed from one generation to the next. It is the case that genetic information influences the phenotypes of organisms. It is the case that it influences their ability to survive and reproduce, and that modifies the frequencies of the genetic material in populations. So all of that is true. And it's also true that, living systems fit into a tree of life, that evolution has occurred. So, natural selection occurs and evolution occurs. That natural selection is therefore the explanation for the complexity and diversity of life is a different thing. So, there's no reason to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? We don't need to go on a rampage denying all of the things which we already know to be true. But the things which were sort of filled in by faith, it's okay to point at them and say, are you sure? Right. So I think that it's taken as a matter of faith that well, since evolution by natural selection is the only possible mechanism for producing adaptive complexity, it must explain the complexity and diversity of all life. It's like, well, how exactly does it do that? Well, we don't know how exactly it does that, but it must, because it's the only game in town.
Yeah. And here's a promissory note.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out one day.
Yeah. And so what about all of these funny things going on? It's like, Well, don't worry about that.
Yeah.
It's a bit like you're looking at the heavens and there's no doubt that the stars are all revolving around the Earth. And somebody says, well, what about these five here that don't seem to be behaving? You say, well, don't worry about those. Don't worry your little head about those, because out of the 5,000 points of light that you can see with the naked eye, 4,995 of them are behaving just fine with our theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Yeah. Okay.
But those five that are misbehaving, they change everything, right? To make sense of those, you suddenly realize, well, we're not the center of the universe, right? And that's a complete paradigm shift in how you think things work, right? So the fact that facts such as organisms can adapt to novel circumstances that are not just adapting on timescales where natural selection can't be doing the adaptation, but also adapting to novel circumstances that evolution by natural selection could never have seen in its evolutionary history either, like properly novel, right? Not just fast adaptation. So when Mike does those experiments with dissolving the heads of planaria with barium, and they find a new way to regulate the osmotic pressure of the cells and regrow a new head in 15 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
that's not natural selection doing that, because it did it in
Right.
15 minutes. And it's not because planaria in their evolutionary past have been exposed to barium and figured out what to do in case anybody puts barium on your head, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That's just never happened before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you could try and explain it with a generic sort of robustness or stress response or something to, well, it hasn't seen barium, but it has seen destructive things.
Mm.
But I think the kind of solution you would have to hypothesize there is one that's a generic problem-solving process, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
doing problem solving on its own time scale, on its own substrates, in its own way. And that it isn't that natural selection has already figured out the answers and canned them, ready to be deployed in whatever circumstances are encountered.
Right. Right. And I might argue that the other thing that fascinates me with Michael's work is the Xenobots and the kenotaxis, and they will go ahead and do that ion channel communication transfer or whatever they're doing to activate inert skin cells to then so yeah, these things are outside of
Yeah.
that
But when you're creating organismic structures, organoid structures that have never been constructed before, you can be sure that whatever they do is not something that they've been selected for, because they don't have an evolutionary history, right?
mhm,
That's an organism which doesn't have an evolutionary history, so it can't be
right.
evolved to do that, right? What it's doing there is a spontaneous response to the environment that it's in and its inherent capacities.
Mhm, mhm.
Mm.
I interviewed a PhD MD student, Deepa Rajan, and she follows Michael's work, and that's probably how I found her. And anyway, she was working with Stentor cerealis, the little single-celled animalcules, and she was habituating behavior or responses from them. It didn't last very long, but I mean, she could keep them responsive to conditioning, associative learning for days or weeks. And
Mm.
so to me, that kind of demonstrates that a single-cell organism has the wherewithal and the capacity, despite the lack of sophistication, to be responsive to the environment, to be responsive in a sense to protect itself. And I only mention that, I guess, to point to the fact that this is a very simple system that is capable, as you said, of making intelligent moves or behaviors, despite there
Yeah,
not being a complex 40 million years of central nervous system develop, or millions of years, hundreds
yeah,
of millions
it's
of years,
single cell
whatever it is.
organisms. So
Yeah.
yes, so the one of the ways of understanding the flip of the Necker cube that I'm interested in is there to talk about the relationship between evolution and cognition. So by cognition, I mean things like memory, learning, problem solving. Mike likes the phrase information integration and collective action.
Right.
And by evolution, I mean of the Darwinian random variation and selective retention. And the conventional understanding of the relationship between those two things is that cognition is rare and special, and it's a product of evolution by natural selection. But evolution by natural selection mostly creates things which are not cognitive, and occasionally, rarely produces things that are. You know, naively, some time ago, we might have thought only humans are properly cognitive. And now we know that, cognition extends to some other organisms. We might let them join the club.
The sentience club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to flip that around, I consider a cognition first theory of evolution rather than a selection first theory of evolution. So what if living things were cognitive from the get-go, and evolution by natural selection was something that they sometimes rarely do? So that evolution by natural selection is a product of cognition rather than cognition is a product of natural selection. So that couldn't work if you think that cognition is special and that only some types of living things can do it.
Yeah.
But the work on basal cognition, as it's sometimes called, that not just higher animals, in inverted commas, not just all animals, but all animals, all plants, all fungi, all single-celled organisms, all bacteria, all living things are cognitive. They have memory, they do learning, they do problem solving, they do information integration and collective action in whatever substrate and environment is relevant to them. And when you begin to recognize that actually cognition isn't a special thing, cognition is coextensive with all life, right? There isn't anything that isn't cognitive. Because to be a living thing that is more than the sum of your parts, you have to be able to integrate information and coordinate collective action. And if you're doing that, you're doing something intrinsically cognitive. You can't be living without being cognitive. So if all living things are cognitive, now you can at least consider the question of what the relationship is between evolution and cognition. That instead of assuming that cognition is a special thing, that natural selection is the driver and it sometimes produces cognition, you can begin to consider the possibility that cognition is throughout all life. And maybe the ability to learn sometimes produces learning systems that can self-reproduce. And then evolution by natural selection begins. Right, so you have a completely different starting point.
So then that natural selection acts more as a constraining factor, excuse me, through environmental interaction or ecological stability or whatever. But that's not, the driving force of why things do what they do necessarily. Sometimes when I'm at my most cynical, and this is very polemical, I would say that if we follow that idea of natural selection, fittedness, and a superior self from the prior filial, you're a filial that is superior, is that human beings have become deeply, deeply maladaptive, in the last, I don't know, settling into agriculture. I don't know, whenever we started beating each other up over resources on a grander scale, and here we are with energy weapons that can annihilate most of the life on this planet, and things will have to reset. So that's me being very polemical, very cynical, but I would say that if we are talking about a fittedness of an organism, we did top out sort of, I like to call us Homo technensis. We're very strongly intelligent, but that is a Malachian dilemma that comes from that, and we can vaporize the plant, and we could also ecocide, all these other potential risks that come with this advancement of the metacognitive ape. That. So I'm sorry, I'm on a tangent of cynicism, but so
Well,
I'm opening the
I'm with
door.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm opening the door to what your thesis is, to say that this is we'll say music, because that's one thing you often do to help work as a metaphor. Or I would say maybe a dance at the music. Yeah, so let's talk about inductive evolution. Bring that idea on board. Sometimes you use the viscoelastic structure analogy. Sometimes you use clay and the conforming in relationality. So if we could open that up, I think the Vervaeke fans and some of the people that subscribe to the channel, because I've had some really great minds on here, so I think they'll really resonate with your thesis on inductive evolution as either synthetic, as a synthesis or complementarity to, again, some of that which can be retrieved from standard Darwinian model.
Yeah. So if you're considering the possibility of a cognition first theory of evolution, then the first question that arises is, well, where does the cognition come from? What's the process by which a system can become cognitive if it wasn't natural selection that did it? So actually, the principles of cognition are, at least of a simple kind, are not particularly demanding. Let's start with memory. I mean, that's just the ability of a system to hold state over time.
Okay.
And, any kind of plastic system does that, right? A footprint in clay holds an impression of its history, right, for some time. So memory is easy. What's difficult more difficult is a system that can hold a memory of more than one thing. So more than one memory of the past held in the same system. And clay can't do that, right? You put a footprint in it, then you put a handprint in it, and then it's now either, at best, you've got an average of the two, or you've just got an imprint of the most recent object that touched it. So to have a system that can hold a memory of more than one thing, it has to find an internal structure or organization which represents both of those things and can reproduce them back again. So it has to have an internal organization that's different from its surface structure. But that doesn't need to be particularly complicated. So you mentioned the natural induction model, which is just a model of particles connected by springs. And the springs control how one particle pushes and shoves against another particle. When you stress the positions of the particles in a way that stresses or creates tensions in the springs, well, then they push back on the particles to push back on whatever was pushing on them. But if the springs are a little bit plastic, if the springs give way under stress, then they deform like the clay does. They just, they give way because you're pushing on them. But because the springs control the relationships between the particles, instead of just directly controlling the positions of the particles, they control the relative distances between particles. That's actually enough for the springs to represent what's called a distributed associative memory. It's like it learns what things go together, instead of just learning a static pattern. And that's enough to do a simple kind of memory that holds more than one pattern. So the memories are held in the structure of the springs, and the structure is put into the springs just by its experience, by being deformed by its experience. And then as you release the springs, they can give you back any of the patterns that they've seen in the past. In machine learning or neural network terms, this would be a Hopfield network, that the weights learn the structure of the patterns that you've trained it on. But it doesn't have to be a clever neural brain-like machinery to do that. Just any system of connections that give way under stress will do that, so long as those connections are creating a sort of internal organization, but you're looking at an external surface. So to move from a memory to a memory of more than one thing to the next step is to get something which generalizes so that it doesn't just recall all the things you've shown it in the past, but it also recognizes or generates other patterns that are different from the ones that you trained it on, different from the ones that it's experienced in the past. But so long as that internal organization is a compression of the patterns that it's experienced in the past, it has to generalize because it can't literally just record a facsimile of every past experience and then look it up like a giant lookup table.
Right.
If it's a compression of the past experience, when it gives it back, it won't be able to give back all and only the patterns in the training set. It will also give you back some other stuff that has similar structural regularities but was not in the training set.
Okay.
So being able to have a memory of more than one thing, being able to generalize to produce patterns which are not the same as anything you've seen in the past, but similar in structural ways, that can all be done by just ordinary physical materials like springs.
Okay.
The next step is, can you get an ordinary physical system to solve a problem rather than just have a memory or have a generalized memory? And that turns out to be not so difficult either, right? The original structure of the springs describes a system of constraints that push the particles around in such a way that they try to resolve those constraints, which is just to say, if they're being pushed this way more than that way, then they go this way, right? And as a system gains experience or has a history over various movements of that kind, it can get better at resolving those constraints so that its movements become smarter, that instead of just going to the quick and easy solution, it goes to a solution that actually looks like it has goal directness or forethought, that it's not going to the obvious answer, it goes to the answer that's a bit further away but a bit better. And you can do all of that in just ordinary physical systems, just particles connected by springs. And so I'm describing it as though it's just masses or particles connected by springs as a purely physical system, because that takes us out of the assumption that there was, if I was talking about a biological system doing that kind of learning or that kind of memory or that kind of problem solving, it's just too easy to assume that natural selection made it do it. Natural selection gave it the necessary properties to do that, or that was where the clever engine was. But the fact that you can do it in just, literally springs made out of metal, is enough to demonstrate that properties of memory, learning, and problem solving that we associate with cognitive systems don't require natural selection, don't require biology, don't require the other characteristics that we usually associate with living organisms. But if particles connected by springs can do it, all you really need is like any network of things connected by relationships that give way under stress. Like any network with those properties would also do it. And biology is full of networks like that, from gene regulation networks to protein interaction networks to cytoskeleton structure to morphogenetic networks and immune systems and bioelectric networks. They're all over biology at all of the different scales, from within individual cells to multicellular organisms and ecosystems. They are full of networks of connections between entities which give way under stress. So when those systems are pushed or stressed by their experience in the world, they are all capable of forming a memory of that history, a generalized memory of that history that produces new responses and gets better at solving the constraints between its components over time. And you don't have to have any natural selection for a system to do that. So that sort of sets up a possibility of natural systems being cognitive before evolution by natural selection is instantiated.
There's so much there. Going to processing in either a fleshy system or like you said, very rudimentary systems. There was something like the thousand brain theory that I don't know if that's still irrelevant, if it's been implemented into machine learning, but there was sort of this hierarchical, consensual coarse graining to refinement, error correction, and that kind of thing. And it came to mind when you were speaking of that, and it wasn't terribly sophisticated. It was just this sort of layered functionality or system function that that allowed there to be a refined answer or a refined outcome. And does that kind of mirror what you were just saying in terms of and I'm not referring necessarily to the spring analogy, but more to the sort of middle ground where you don't need a deeply complex multi-organal system to be able. It's a system of again, coarse graining to refinement to consensus to higher order processing to produce an outcome. But nonetheless, very elegant and simple.
Yeah, I think that I think that's not an unreasonable way to think about it. So at these different levels of biological organization, there are different entities at different scales. And for any one particular scale that you choose to focus on, like the scale of cells, the entities at the level below, we tend to think of them as being sort of inert material, right? The organic molecules inside the cell, they're not living things, they're just organic molecules. And we think of the level above, the tissue, the organ, the organism in which the cell might be living, or the community, if it's a bacterium in a biofilm, we think of that as being like environmental constraints on its behavior. But that's just a perspective that's relevant to that particular level of biological organization. If instead you were looking at a different level of biological organization, you were looking at the multicellular organism, the whole organism, then we tend to think of the cells as though they're just parts, right? There's this kind of cell here and there's that kind of cell there, and they're wired up to do what they need to do for the organism. And again, the environment outside the organism, that's just an environment that places constraints on its behavior. But there isn't any particular level of organization which is special, right? You can do that at any level of organization, as Mike would say, cognition all the way down. That whatever level of organization you look at, it's always the case that a couple of levels below just looks inert, and a couple of levels above just looks like a geometric constraint. But it's really the level that you choose to focus at is where the cells are, where the individuals are, right? And whatever level you look at, if you were to choose to look at the level below, you would find, oh, actually, there's individuals there too, that the cells of which a multicellular organism is made have their own agency. They're doing their own problem solving. They have their own adaptive mechanisms. And inside each of the cells, the organelles, the functional components within the cell, oh, look, they're doing their own adaptive mechanisms. They're doing their own problem solving. They have their own way of being responsive to their history of experience, and so on. So each level is composed of structures from the level below, which I prefer to think of in what I would say as a scale invariant way, right? Yeah. So that they're, instead of saying, no, the genes, they're the thing that's in control of everything. And the organisms all the way up there, they're just lumbering robots, controlled by their genes for the purposes of servicing the survival and reproduction of the genes. Or the other way around, you could say, well, only the organism is a real agent, and the organism is controlling the activity of its genes to suit its functional purposes, right? You do things at that level, and you have a top-down view, but neither of those views is telling the whole picture, right? It's like you can take any level of organization, and the levels above and the level below look like they're not agents, but really they are if you look at those levels as well.
So is there a tonos or a tension between supervenience and emergence in this? You're saying it's not the whole story. Is there a third factor or another factor perhaps in that relationship?
So if uh, uh, instead of thinking about things as being exclusively bottom up, which is, genes first way of thinking about things, molecules first way of thinking about things, which is the conventional way, or a rather unorthodox way of thinking about things in terms of, agents that control their parts, which control their subparts, which control their pod parts in a top-down sort of way. I think that it's more appropriate to think of selves at a particular level of organization making space for themselves by pushing upwards against the geometric constraints, the boundary conditions that are given by the level above, and pushing downwards on the material or substance constraints of the things that they're made of. And they're making a little bit of space for themselves in between, right? It's more of a sort of pushing outwards in both directions. And there are, rather than thinking about it as, oh, it's all bottom up or it's all top down or it's a mixture of the two or it's a tension of them, it's more that a self, a living thing, is a cycle of activity which is going on at a particular level of organization. But what's special about living systems is it's not just a cycle which is self-sustaining, but it's a cycle which continually recreates the circumstances for its own origination, so that it can disappear, but the information is pushed upwards and downwards into different levels of organization in such a way that it's gone for a moment, and then those levels of organization push back and create an individual again in the next life cycle of that organism, right? So you can think of an organism, let's do a single-celled organism with a life cycle that it pushes the information, an individual pushes its information downwards into its genetic material and upwards into the environment that it creates through its activity, such that that individual's life can end, but that environment with that genes recreates a life again in the next life cycle. Right? So that the upwards and downwards are recreating, the organism creates the conditions for its own origination later in time. And it's a different way of thinking about things than, no, it's just the genes. The genes make the genes make the genes make the genes make the genes, almost as though everything that happens above that doesn't really matter, except in so much as it affects the genes make the genes make the genes make the genes, right? Instead, you can take any level of organization and find that pattern.
Again, there's two or three things going on in the hamster cage.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay, because I was thinking of James Baldwin when we were talking about environmental relationality, but also there was something else that came to mind. I don't want to lose it. Oh yeah, I like to abuse the idea of either extended mind or distributed cognition in the sense of what you're talking about, that the system. And so we look at the species of humanity as a cellular system for a moment, and that the cellularity is autopoietic, and that, like you said, that information is transferred per generation or per filial. And I love the beauty of that in the sense that, it's it's not just protein unfolding that happens. It's more that the learnedness or the mindedness in a sense is distributed into that next generation. And so again, I go out to that weird use of the idea of either like an extended, not the Chalmers extended mind, but sort of an extended cognition or a distributed cognition in a sense. And I may be abusing that. It may not deserve a species of its own in that sense. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that works for me.
Okay.
I don't really think that they're that it makes sense to talk about cognition belonging at one level or in one thing. Cognition is always something that's distributed. Like all individuals are collective individuals, right? They're all made of parts which are individuals within them. And I think that all cognitions are really, they're really about the relationships between things, and how those things respond to one another. Because it's the structure of the interactions that needs to reflect the thing that it's cognizing about, right? To be a model of the thing that it's of its environment, to put it simply, and to be a model of its environment that's a proper analog causal model of that environment. It needs to have components in it that do the same kinds of interactions as the thing that it's trying to model out there in the world. So it's I don't know if that spoke correctly to what you were offering there, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, it does. It's another, I think, another angle out from the idea that I was floating around with whatever. It's either again, it's not the Chalmers, it's not the notebook or the handbook. It's more a broader, extended cognition mind, whatever it is, the intelligence that is transferred. Maybe that's the way to look at it. And when you were saying what you said, I was wondering about. Oh shoot! It just dropped out. That's okay. Now, where? Well, I've totally derailed myself. You're doing this to me. It's like I just love these ideas. And I'm sorry I'm fumbling here.
Shall we talk about the harmony and the love?
Let's do that. And if you don't mind, if I do manage to pull myself to so yeah, here we go. I'm sorry. Came together. You were talking about love. Are these aggregated individual ensembles of experience into a unitary experience? Seems to be rather fascinating in the sense that, again, we, as Michael would say, we're a collective, and that collective can then coalesce into what in sort of a psycho-emotional sense is a unitary self. What are your thoughts on that? Like I assume that, and we could call it inductive evolution or evolution itself, affords us that unitary experience, because God knows, we were all just, it would be combinatorially explosive and chaos and madness and all that. So it's kind of a dumb question, but it's like the grace of a unitary experience that is afforded to a higher intelligence system like this, like the Justin or the Richard.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. So, the fact that we have an experience of anything, that we have a first person experience, let alone a unitary experience.
Right.
Wouldn't we all like to make sense of that, right?
Yeah.
What on earth is that? The hard problem. But the fact that it's unitary, I can say something about how it can be unitary rather than just a collection. Although I can't say much about why it's a unitary experience, right? Like, how do you? So there's a question there of what makes a collective one thing and not just a collective. Right? So there's a particular way of describing the kinds of relationships between things that makes them what's called non-linearly separable. So you can talk about the conditions under which the behavior of the whole, the relationship between the behavior of a part and the behavior of a whole, the whole is sensitive to what all the other parts are doing. Okay. So that you can't decompose the system into smaller subsystems and say, but I've still described the whole thing. Right. So you have a notion of it being a whole that is more than the sum of the parts in a formal sense. So I think that's saying something about it being unitary, but it's not saying something about it being a unitary experience.
Okay.
Because I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people are straining vessels on that whole thing.
Yeah.
But the one thing, Michael got me off the hook, and this is one of the greatest gifts he's given me so far, is that in studying his work and listening to him talk and having conversations with guys like you is he's not terribly worried about consciousness, that
Right.
that dreaded word, or the first person perspective. I tend to lens it more from complexification, aggregation, and consciousness does something, and I'm not really too worried about what it is or if it has a metaphysical standing or any of that kind of stuff. But what fascinates me is that, again, Stentor Cerealius, and then, little amino acids floating around in some primal thing 3.5 billion years ago that sort of boop, turned synpoesis or autopoiesis into something. I see it all still on a continuum, right? And I'm not invoking panpsychism in the least because it's not terribly interesting to me. But the idea that systemicity, as it is cellular or whole, yet we can, from our perspective, differentiate it into cellular systems, whether it's galaxies or little molecules, that the Hertz rate of organization or whatever it was that caused the light to come on in a living system, and we now have this biological process, this biological organization of stuff that the universe affords us. And anyway, I'm on a tangent, but so I go straight up to where we are right now having this conversation, and it's so that doesn't, to me, consciousness is not necessarily exciting or a deep question. It's more that on that continuum, that at that singularity of stuff in a pool with warm liquid, to there being this whatever it is that's going on. I don't know how to describe it, to where we
Yeah.
are,
Yeah.
is all on a continuum, and it's not, that to me is not terribly, it could be controversial, I guess. But the fact that's we're at this point, and there's probably, if we talk ontological layers, probably stuff going on way beyond our apprehension and our capability to understand. And I'm not invoking supernatural. It's just,
Well, if there
more
was, we wouldn't know. Yeah.
right, deeper complexified organization, maybe higher intelligence. Who the heck? And Michael's working with that weird stuff, hybrids and whatever. What are we going to?
Yeah. I mean,
to
can
do
you
about it?
imagine that an individual neuron comprehends what you as a unitary experience is thinking, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Your neurons have no idea what you're thinking.
Right. There's passing things along, little gap junctions, as Michael says. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and the one thing, again, with Michael's imagination, mostly spurned on by science fiction, where he's thinking about the morphospace and the potential, and what it's like we are a method rather than, we are a system, but we are also a method by which this seemingly continuous self-organizing systemicity is, working with or through us. And I'm not invoking anything magical there. It's just that we are likely to craft things in the future, or likely to help organize things in the future. Again, if Michael has his way, that are going to go way beyond our constrained, perceptual box of what intelligence is, what life is, and what organizational capacities there are in that sense. So it just, that blows my mind a lot more than, what is qualia, or what is a qualitative experience. I mean, that's cool, and I don't want to dismiss it, because it's absolute. You and I couldn't be doing what we're doing without, even on an epistemic level, we have to acknowledge qualia, we have to acknowledge all these things. But suddenly with Michael's work, it just, the whole hard problem thing and the metaphysical standing of qualia just kind of falls away. And I'm like, that's
Yeah,
cool.
look,
But
there are plenty of hard problems within the easy problem, right?
right.
Like, without, before you wonder about consciousness, I'm nearly always happy to talk about what's that expression? Competence without comprehension, right? So
Yeah.
So a cognitive system that has the competence to do memory, learning, and problem solving, without the comprehension that it's doing it, right? That's a different matter. But I also have some sympathy for Don Hoffman's starting point. He's like, why do you want to build the universe out of cognition, right? Why do you want to build the universe out of consciousness? It's like, because you can't see any other way in which you can solve the hard problem. And I have some sympathy for that, right? Because I like positions that rip up everybody else's position and start again, right?
Yeah, contrarian. Yeah.
And it's one of those, what are you going to do about those 5 planets that are not behaving, right? Those 5 heavenly bodies that are not behaving, right? And if you consistently ignore, the the one thing that we know about the universe for sure, like i.e. our first person experience, and you say, well, I'm gonna come back to that later.
Yeah.
And instead I'm going to analyze to death everything that isn't that, knowing full well that that will never touch, that one heavenly body that's not behaving, right?
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
I have some I have a lot of sympathy for taking a position that starts from, well, I myself go as far as, everything's uh, everything's cognitive and everything's made out of cognition.
Hmm.
It's how big a leap there is from that to everything's made out of consciousness. It's not clear to me yet.
Yeah, yeah, I don't go that far. Like again, I mentioned to you before we hit record that I've interviewed Bernardo. I probably have 11 hours of conversation with him, but I'm not. And I can't because I'm just not that bright. But I mean, I don't think I would metaphysically commit to that statement that it's all consciousness. But I'm sympathetic to a kind of a monist. So if I were to identify as anything, I'd be a phasal monist. And it's not neutral or what's the dual aspect monism. It's more a kind of phasal monism that it may not be necessary to understand the ontological primitive, but that from the shadows and the reflections that we're seeing is again, it's a systemicity of organization. It doesn't satisfy to say that, but if we're on a continuum, for me, it makes the hard problem less of a hard problem to say that matter and mind, mindedness, it doesn't have to be exclusive like a substance dualism or anything like that. I just think that, if we can, so in other words, the idea of intelligence is a semantic move that we make. It is arbitrary in the sense that we are tiny little primates on a tiny little insignificant, solar system, yada yada. And again, I was talking to you about apophasis before we hit record. It's like I know not I know I'm engaged with something, but I dare not define it because it's ineffable. And for me as a layperson, maybe that's the satisficiency that I need to say that, I can move along knowing that there is materiality and that I interact with an environment, a reality, and that I am also aware of that environment and reality. But to me, it's not special sauce to know that the sense organs, the sensory motor loop and the data and all this kind of thing is magic in a sense that it's just on this long continuum, and it's not satisfying to say that, but for me it kind of makes, like you just said, it helps me focus on other things that might be more interesting that we can apprehend and we can work with. So which might be a good cheesy segue to talk about love. And I love your definition of love. I've heard some really profound ways of poetically stating something that is deeply important to us, but also prevalent, and almost seemingly, ubiquitous or whatever. And love might be one of those things. But you're saying, and I'll say it, and then you can correct me if I stray out. That let's talk about an individual. One makes oneself vulnerable to know or to understand, or one goes into sympathy or resonance with another. It could be another object or another, art or any of these things to know it. And I'll stop there and let you to elaborate more on this.
Yeah. So let's say first that the conventional way of understanding, go back to the conventional model of bottom up, genes first, natural selection writes the script.
Mm-hmm.
What room is there for love in that story, right?
Yeah.
So in that story, love is nothing more than, well, if it's anything at all, it's just what your genes make you feel in order to secure their survival and reproductive interests. It's a a trick that's not something of our choosing, but that it's just driven by that bottom up imperative.
Right.
So my working definition of love, the kind that's relevant to vulnerable relationships with others, but I mean vulnerable not in a weak way, but in a compassionate and empathetic way,
Mm-hmm.
is a deeply vulnerable mutual knowing. So love is about knowing another in a way that is not just superficial, but comes to understand the same stresses and pressures and responses of another person, if we're talking about two people. It can't just be a superficial knowing, but it needs to be deep. And you need to not just be able to predict what they're doing in the short term, or how they might respond to, or what their likes or dislikes are in the short term, but something which understands how they work inside in a way that mirrors. You can only do that by mirroring how they work inside. When you really know somebody in that way, it's not just that you can predict how they will respond to things, or what stresses them, but that because you've become a deep model of them, the same things stress you. That you feel the same things that they feel, rather than just predicting how they would feel about it. To know somebody deeply like that actually requires you to change. I can't know you deeply and still stay the same person that I was before I knew you, right? Because by taking on knowledge of you, I'm internalizing something about you that changes who I am. And I can't know you that deeply without allowing myself to change. If I try to hold on to me as I am and just add knowledge of you as though that knowledge was just something that I can hold, but that doesn't make sense. That the knowledge of you actually needs to change the structure of me. And it's mutual, because it has to be bidirectional. It has to be two-way. It has to be a dance that we do between the two of us, that you're changing in a way which responds to who I am, and I'm changing in a way that responds to who you are. I've used a metaphor of dancers. I don't know if this will work for you, see how you like it. So imagine that we were dance partners, and you were dancing and I was trying to learn what you were doing. And to start with, we do my training in a very dumb way, that we literally tie my wrists to your wrists and my ankles to your ankles, so that I have to move wherever you go, right? But if I'm just fluid, if I'm just water, if I'm just like a shadow to you, we're not dance partners at all, right? That's just you dancing and me shadowing, right? If instead I bring something to the party, or if I'm bringing something to the dance, then if I were to bring too much, then the way that you move would clash against the way that I move. We wouldn't be sympathetic to each other's movements or able to anticipate each other's movements. So that other extreme is not right either. So in between, I might want to be able to anticipate how you're going to move to the music, to feel the music in the same way that you do, so that instead of just waiting for you to respond to it and then following, I'm anticipating with you that kind of response. But I can never do that perfectly, because I don't have direct access to what's inside you. I don't have direct access to your internal states, your mental states, how you really feel about the music and how that might touch you. So I'm always doing a model of you, which is always sort of an approximation. And that feels like maybe a little bit disappointing. Oh, it's never going to be perfect. But that gap between being identical to you but wanting to know you better creates me doing movements to the music which are not the same as the movements that you do, but they're not identical, but they're not arbitrarily unrelated either. And in those, in a sense, the movements that I do become almost like they were a different guess about what you might have done from what you actually did. It's almost as though I become like a divergent copy of you. Like if you'd gone forward into the future, you could have done this, or you could have done that. But actually, you did this and I did that. That we're different copies of the same path. And in that space in between us is where we begin to create something new.
Mm-hmm.
That space between us that's created by the different approximations to one another that we're doing creates new movements, way making, that each of the movements that we do creates an opportunity to respond to one another, that creates a new dynamic and a new focus for us to move around. So there's a knowing of each other.
Mm-hmm.
I need to model you in order to anticipate. It's mutual that, you know, you need to model me, I need to model you. It's vulnerable in so much as I actually need to become you, right? I actually need to become something that internalizes you. Then that changes me, and the me that I was won't be the same ever again in that knowing.
Right, right.
And it's deep, that it can't just be a shadow, right? It has to be something that is generative, that knows you deeply enough that it can do inductive modeling, inductive generalization from it.
That's something I was thinking of, is that we were talking about scale invariance earlier. This is an instance of that scale invariance, and that there is a mutually conforming scenario with people attempting to synchronize or learn synchrony as best can be done by two agents, and that mutual conforming then, like you said, both has the affect, that when separate, that's imbued upon each of the two agents, but also the idea again that inducing of, so that's where the vulnerability comes in. That's like, I'm going to put my interests aside momentarily to really get to know you and know how again two persons or two agents can move in a rhythm or a synchrony to produce a harmonic experience or a harmonic expression that might be pleasing to an outside perspective or to the two perspectives. And one thing I love about when we talk about vulnerability, if I not abusing the etymology of vulnerable, that vulnerary is a healing art. The vulnerary practitioner is one who is a nurse or someone who heals people. And so to be vulnerable is, to me, there's a latent potential for a transformative experience, if at the very least, but perhaps one with a positive valence or positive outcome. So that's some of the things I was taking away from that. But again, to be that intimate with somebody, and being that vulnerable with someone, with a mutual, like a co-conforming interest, if that's not a redundancy, a conforming interest to learn the dance, and that dance is beyond just gesticulation and movement and things like that, but it is learning to be again in that phase state with someone, that synchrony with someone.
Yeah.
And that teaches a lot about, how to be a good cell, like a good compatible cell. Like when we talk about Mike Levin's work, he talks about, like rogue cells that break away and become malignant. They're in a default altruism. I always use the liver as an analogy, but every little liver cell has to be a good liver cell. They have to be good with their partners, and that ion channel, the communication has to be there, and they all and if they dare break away, then you get malignancy and things like that. So I'm stretching things, but yeah.
Well, that dance that they're doing, you notice that it isn't just, well, one of them's in control and everybody else has to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't, neither is it that they're all programmed exactly the same and you just start them running so they all do it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like an organism isn't a whole bunch of cells all doing the same thing. And a dance isn't, it isn't synchronized swimming, right? Synchronized swimming is a boring as a form of dance, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have any creativity in the movement and the interaction between the participants. So the cells of your body are in a state of deeply vulnerable mutual knowing with the other cells of the body, right? And has different scales, the cells and the neighboring cells and the tissue and the organ and the organism. But each of those levels has, within a level, there are, to the extent that there are different entities or compartments within that level, they are all modeling each other. So that notion of, as I was describing it, as though it's a deeply vulnerable mutual knowing between two people, that deeply vulnerable mutual knowing is what makes an organism more than a bag of parts, right? It's what makes a living thing from the components of which it is composed.
Yeah.
So I'm really describing love not just as, the thing that is familiar to us at the human scale, but as the glue that binds all living things, that makes them more than the sum of the parts, and that it's really a kind of intelligence that, that ability to model another system deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in any other context, you would say, well, you're going to have to be smart to do that, right? You're going to have to, observe this thing, which is not telling you all of the information that you needed, right? Is that you can only see the surface, you can't see the working parts, but you have to figure out what the working parts are inside it, right?
Yeah, quickly.
That requires intelligence, right? That,
Yeah.
it's a deep learning problem to do that. That
Yeah.
requires deep induction to do it.
Yeah.
When we do that between people, we create something that's more than the sum of the parts. We create a relationship between us that isn't just one person and another person, or one person and a copy of them,
Mm-hmm.
but something that's more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
Through the interaction, through the spaces that they create between them, the complementarity, the lines of symmetry, the divergences and convergences of their trajectories. And that's what's going on at all of the different levels of living systems, that connects the different entities at one level of organization with each other, but also with the different levels of entities at the next at levels above, and entities at level below are connected
Mm-hmm.
through those dances too.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to bring the music and harmony part into it.
Yeah.
So the music of life is a metaphor that's been used a lot, right? That people talk about, use it to invoke notions of beauty, of many parts working together, of things sort of like they're following a plan or a script. That many different instruments playing their part, but responding to one another, that kind of metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy with all of that, except the following a script bit. I don't much like that.
Mm-hmm.
But or a score. It's more like jazz than following a score is the kind of music.
Right. Improv. Yeah.
But there's something much more technically mechanistic, technically interesting, cognitively competent than that sort of level of metaphor, right? Which is to do with the rhythms of activity that happen at these different levels of organization. So at any one level of organization, we're not interested so much in sort of static or inert patterns of organization. We're interested in processes which are self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find self-sustaining processes all over physics, not just all over biology. But a self-sustaining process at one level of organization, like a tornado or whatever, if it's just at one level of organization, that doesn't do a lot of work for us, right? Tornadoes aren't very smart. Tornadoes aren't really living systems, right? But there are phenomena of resonance and phase synchronization between processes with rhythm at different frequencies and different scales, which help us understand how the different biological scales link together and how they work together. So just as a sort of a very brief sort of, teaser, really, you're familiar with the experiment of the phase synchronization between two metronomes on a wobbly board.
Yeah.
So you have a metronome and another metronome, and they're set to the same frequency, but they're started at slightly different times, so they're not waving
Right.
um, in phase, right?
Yeah.
But if you put them on a platform that can move a little bit, then after a time they phase synchronize, they
Mm.
communicate, the vibrations through the board communicate in such a way that they each adjusts the phase of their activity to synchronize with each other.
Good.
So that's a kind of communication that can happen between two systems that operate at the same frequency, regardless of what they're made out of. It doesn't matter whether these are oscillations in bioelectricity or oscillations in the Krebs cycle or oscillations in some sort of protein interaction network or oscillations in the mechanics of the shape of the cell. It doesn't matter what that substrate is. You get that kind of communication between rhythms of activity sort of for free. It comes from the physics. You don't have to engineer that, select that, design that. Like if you have something that's doing something and something else that's doing something, if they're doing it at the same frequency, they will talk to each other, they will resonate with one another, they will phase synchronize. Fine. What's more interesting is that if you have a metronome of one frequency and a metronome of another frequency, they pretty much can't see each other, right? Sometimes this one is pulling when that one is pushing, sometimes, but then it's just as often pushing as when that one is pulling. So the net effect is nothing, unless they're different frequencies, but they have a harmonic ratio. And the
Mm-hmm.
simplest harmonic ratio is the octave, the 2-to-1 frequency. So if one of them is beating twice for each time the other one is beating once, they will also phase lock in such a way that there's 2 beats of this one to 1 beat of that one in a way that fits together in a particular phase relationship. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, there are 2 phase relationships that they will fit together. Now, that's more interesting because in general, things at high frequencies belong at small physical scales, and things at slow frequencies belong at large physical scales, like a long string or a long organ pipe has a low frequency. A
Oscillation. Yeah.
short string or a short organ pipe has high frequencies. But remember that it doesn't matter what they're made out of. So you could make the slow frequencies out of bioelectric waves, and you could make the fast frequencies out of gene regulation networks, or the other way around, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
But if they have that harmonic ratio, they will talk to each other. They will communicate between those levels of organization. And you don't have to design that. You don't have to select that. That can't not happen, right? So the cycles which sustain are not just the cycles which um, synchronize with other cycles of activity at the same level of organization, but they're also the cycles which interact upwards and downwards in frequency and upwards and downwards in scale in those harmonic ratios also talk to each other. And that's a way in which you can start with one note at a particular frequency at a particular scale. It creates harmonic vibrations at the scale above and the scale below in such a way that that note can disappear. But those 2 notes at that interval create a space between them that recreates the note which was gone.
Mm.
You remember I was saying at the beginning that a living thing is a system which creates the circumstances, repeatedly recreates the circumstances for its own origination, right? So a vibration at one frequency pushes upwards into the frequencies above and below, creating an interval which then recreates the note that's in between.
Mm.
So there's actually a physics of resonance and phase synchronization that helps us understand how this actually works. It isn't just a metaphor for, isn't life beautiful? Or isn't it all amazing how it all fits together? But there's a physics of how rhythms of activity communicate with each other at one level of organization and upwards and downwards in different levels of organization, and a mathematics of what rhythms talk to which other rhythms in the harmonic ratios that provides a way of understanding how memory, learning, and problem solving can get smarter by getting deeper, right? Remember that when I was talking about the remembering more than one thing, said that to remember more than one thing, you needed to change the internal organization of the system. And the internal organization of the system needed to be a compressed model of the thing that you were trying to learn. So as you change frequencies, your the physics of harmonic resonance are naturally doing that kind of compression. And as the frequencies give back the other way, they're naturally doing that kind of expansion. So when you have multiple layers of frequencies all connected together, you have a sort of deep compression and expansion of whatever is going on at one level is pushed into other levels and back again. And when that happens, that's what makes things look smart. That's what makes things look agential. That's what gives them the ability to do deeply vulnerable mutual knowing, right? The ability to change their internal organization in such a way that they become a better model of the other thing. So if you have a system that has layers of organization like that, then it's the kind of thing that can do that kind of deeper cognition or deeper knowing.
I like to create dronescapes. And so some of what you were talking about is a ghost that I've been chasing for years. I have a keyboard and a computer over here, and I just sit and I torture myself. Yeah, because someday I'm going to create that perfect harmony or whatever it is I'm looking for. But I've turned out hours of dronescapes and none of them have ever satisfied me. This is a bizarre tangent, but I'm glad you're talking in these metaphors or in the analogy of music because, and I don't have a musical bone in my body, but it doesn't take. Synthesizers are very easy to interface with, and if you spend a few hours, you get to know the synthesizer, you get to know how to work with keys and time stretch and all these little tricks that you can get to do something that has a pleasing resonance to it that makes a connection. It's not really addressing what you just said 100%, but it's something that came to mind is that, wow, I've been chasing this. I don't know what it is I'm looking for, but there's a sound that I don't know that I want to find or a piece of noise that I want that I think if I meditate with it, I'll have an extraordinary experience.
Well, those feelings of, what combinations of notes sound good and what doesn't, right? There's some cultural element to it, but there's also deep mathematics to it too.
Okay.
And it's the way in, when you get one system to resonate to another, that's only possible when they're capable of holding the same key, right? It doesn't have to be the same frequency, but it has to be the same sort of fundamental that they're built from. Right? And as you find resonance with a piece of music, those intervals, I think, are actually reaching inside you and transforming something, right? They are, a synthesizer that isn't doing it in a mutual way,
right?
Except in so much as that it's coming back out of your fingers to press a different key if it's not right? That you're really playing with your own reflection as you do that, but through that medium, in a way which those, when I'm talking about things resonating with one another, I don't necessarily mean things that are going in your ears, right? Not just
right. No. I was stepping out of your analogy just to say, when you were talking, I was thinking, how can I apply this to this madness of mine that I must create the perfect, whatever it is, 20-minute dronescape or whatever that will send me off on some sort of weird, mind journey or whatever. But no, I see the analogy that you're talking about is and again, I just keep going back to the scale invariance of the inductive. It doesn't even have to be evolution. It's the inductive process and the process relation in producing, in the instance that you were speaking of memory and apprehension and things like that. So and I don't have a witty comeback to any of that other than how do we transfer that out into our psychology
Mm,
and
mm.
the sort of real-time relations that we have with
Yeah,
that which is out there in the
yeah.
world?
Like, so what, right? How does that alter how we live our lives, right?
Well,
How do we bring that into a human
n
context?
not a dismissive so what, to take what you said and
Yeah.
bring it with us into the idea that this, and I'll also bring in something that you talked about, how um phase and harmonics and so forth is, and I'm not doing this justice, but it's two ways. There is that which generates the resonance, and then that which is affected by that resonance. So you were talking about Faraday worms, and we could bring
Mm,
cymatics into this. So that
mm.
there's this, I don't know if it's an inverse relationship. You could do much better, at opening this up, but that's something also that I found fascinating about what you were just talking about is that, when we come into phase and when things are communicating at different octaves or different keys, like a C's, different C's or F's to C's or whatever, that things coalesce in that. So like again, the Faraday worms might be an instantiation of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Maybe
right. So
not. Maybe not.
the uh the ability of systems to communicate um is always, through resonance, is always bidirectional.
Okay.
So, when you have two things resonating, that means that they've found a phase relationship where they don't push on each other anymore. Right? Where when the two oscillators are completely in phase, um, they're not interfering with each other anymore. They're in a sort of perfect uh,
Relationship.
balance with each other.
Okay.
But when they're out of phase, one of them is pushing when the other one is pulling, and that creates a little bit of stress in their movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that stress which causes the little bit of internal reorganization that causes them to change. But that's always a bidirectional push and a shove, right? And I I can't change your phase. I can only change our phase relationship, and that's
Mm-hmm.
a necessarily symmetric relationship.
Yeah.
But the ability of vibrations to organize physical matter is just totally fascinating. The Faraday worms and the Faraday waves and the Chladni plates and the cymatic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when you do it between uh, a sound wave and an ordinary um, material, you can already make surprisingly interesting patterns. But you can see that they have a somewhat limited geometric simplicity to them when you
Mm-hmm.
understand them a bit better. It's like, oh, I see what it is. It's just, a couple of sine waves intersecting with each other or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But um, when you have rhythms that are generated by a system that has some depth
Yeah.
and vulnerability, that's interacting with another system of rhythms that has some depth and vulnerability, then the dance that they can do is much more intricate. Right? The dance that they can do pushes both ways, changes the organization of each of the two systems, creates shapes between them that wasn't already a part of either of the systems that you started with. So let me see if I can say something about that. What does it matter to how we live our lives, right? Because with some ways back in the conversation, I mentioned how no theory has had a greater impact on how we understand our place in the universe and what our lives are for than evolution by natural selection.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a different theory, does it alter any of that? Does it alter how we understand our purpose, our role in the universe, our relationship to other living things and non-living things. And I think that it does. The reductionist framework can only arrive at the Darwinian model. It can only arrive at a model which is based on self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
It can only arrive at a model where the logical thing for me to do is what's best for me. It can only arrive at a model where if you can tell me what the objective criteria are that I'm trying to maximize, I'll maximize it, right? And you have that sort of optimization process. You know, if you tell me what's good, I'll go in the good direction, right? And that's already gone wrong, right? Taking that idea about what life is like, that, you know, give me some criteria and I'll maximize it, I'll optimize it. like that's, it's so already gone wrong. You can see how it leads to the destruction of everything if you think that's what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you think what you're trying to do is just tell me which way to go and I'll go there, tell me what the goal is and I'll optimize it, that's already gone wrong. How is the cognition first, harmony based view of things different from that? Well, a simple way to say it is you can't optimize harmony. You can't say, what's the best harmony? Show me the best harmony. I want to see the best one, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that doesn't make sense, right? Harmony is always about a relationship. It's always about a relationship between the observer and the observed, the dance that they're doing together, about the spaces that they create between them. Each note that you lay down places some constraints on the notes that can come next, but it also opens up new spaces which invite other notes into that space. And as each one recedes, it begs for resolution of the, you know, the tensions that are created by the notes that have already been laid down. And that creating the space of possibilities as you go, or the adjacent possible, is a much more dynamic space of possibilities where you recognize that you know, there is no best note, there is no best harmony, there is no sense of give me an objective function for what this piece of music is supposed to do and I'll maximize it. It doesn't work that way. Harmony is always about the relationships between things, the spaces that they create between them, the possibility of resonance between the systems that you're talking about, the context in which it sits, the geometric constraints from above, the material constraints from below. You have to be in the same language. It's a dialogue, right? And it's like the difference between real intelligence and an IQ test, right? Real intelligence is about really knowing what you're talking about, really understanding things, being able to use it in a creative circumstance, being able to do the back and forth between the problem and the solution, the dance of the subject and the object. But when you turn that into an IQ test, just, you know, can you maximize your score against this test? You've missed the point.
Yeah.
Right? That's not it. And, you know, living systems are in that dance of mutual knowing of each other, of intelligence that's about knowing each other, and the vulnerability that creates the spaces between them. And that's been misunderstood as, oh, this one is trying to optimize its fit to its environment, right? And if you take it as a task of optimizing its fit to its environment, that's like find the best note. It's like, no, that's not it, right? Because it creates the space of possibilities. The space of possibilities changes with each movement that it makes, right? So that it's a mutual relationship and not a static objective function.
Right.
So that changes, I think, changes for me how, you know, what do I think I'm supposed to do with my cognition? What am I supposed to do with myself? What am I supposed to do with my own agency? And how am I supposed to interact with you, anyone else in the universe, or the natural world? It's like, I'm not trying to maximize my survival reproduction for a start. That's not what it's all about. I'm not trying to optimize anything. I'm not trying to be better than anything. There is no greater than or less than. There are just relationships in a dance where some things fit for a while, nothing is enduring. All relationships are, a sort of a tumbling dance that comes to an end, but in coming to an end, it creates a new space. And it just takes away all of that, feeling of, grasping and aversion, right? They, trying to hold on to things as they are, trying to get rid of the things that you don't want, trying to separate yourself from your environment and the things which threaten you, because you don't have any meaning at all except in relation to that stuff, except in relation to the stuff which is outside you. You don't even exist. You're not even a thing except in relation to the stuff that's outside you. And the idea that you can build walls around you that protect you from your environment to secure your survival is like, that's just so totally missed the point. That's so just totally missed the point about what a living thing is. And the internalization of a survival of the fittest mentality of, life is about protecting your survival. Life is about hoarding your resources. Life is about treating your environment, exploiting and extracting what you need from your environment to serve your interests.
Right.
It's just like, what are you doing? Like, that's not what it's about, right? Like, in your heart that that's not what it's about, and that's not bringing you joy. But what I'm hoping to connect with is a framework that makes sense of living systems where you can see that that's not what it's about.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that reach you?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we're coming up on an hour, or we're just over an hour and 45 minutes, and I'm already thinking part two. How can we move beyond? Let's abstract ourselves away from inductive evolution as a theory that works to understand what the species is doing, but also, again, and the one thing I don't criticize Dawkins for is popularizing the meme, and sort of, so there's the meme system, and that's kind of a crude way, so it's the psychosocial domain, it is the thought virus, it's the language and communication, it's mimesis, it's all those things going on, and we model, as you just said, we model a lot of our behavior and attitudes on that Darwinian model of fittedness and survival and exploitation and dominance and all these things. So I'll check in with you now to see if we could maybe do a second conversation to, again, abstract ourselves out, not necessarily, but somewhat abstract ourselves out into this domain of, again, the psychosocial human, that if we're lensing things currently through that survival, that fittedness paradigm, that if we can imagine over here the inductive process that you address, and what are the normatives and ethos or the ethics that come out of that. I'd be curious in exploring that with you if you want to have another. We can continue now on this, and maybe we'll start to bring this to a conclusion. But if you're interested, I would love to have you back for that conversation, because I think it can be had in a way that is imaginative and envisioning for others, and it may not
Well,
be for
sure. I
our.
would love to do that with you.
Okay.
I find myself in this tension where, I want to talk about the things that matter in a way that's accessible. And, I want to tell you about springs and shit, right? I want
Yeah,
to tell
yeah,
you
yeah.
about, the technical nitty gritty and compressing spaces and and that kind of stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
if if you're going to turn around our understanding of what living systems are and what our place in the universe is in a way that matters to us on a, what was the expression you used, psychopersonal level,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
uh,
psychosocial. Yeah.
psychosocial, uh, it's got to be based on something,
Yeah.
right? You can't just pull it out of thin air, right? You've got to have a mechanism by which things can work, and a reason for displacing the status quo, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
to show what's wrong with our current way of understanding things.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't need no you don't need me to tell you that love is the way, right? That
Mm-hmm.
it's not about an extractive, discompassionate, exploitative way of living your life is not going to bring you joy in the long term. And by the
Right.
way, it isn't about your joy in the long term anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there's at least a kind of person that knows that already and isn't bothered about the fact that science and the bottom up reductionist natural selection first way of view is incompatible with that, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
they're just not bothered with the fact that it's incompatible with the science. And then there's the other kind of person that's knows the science and is not bothered by the fact that's incompatible with love, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so I'm personally not satisfied with those two things being just talking past each other. I want to understand how they relate to one another, and I'm not well practiced at that yet. So I
Mm-hmm.
welcome more conversation in that territory.
Okay, good. And we can bring some of the technical ideas and like attractors and different things, and maybe I'll arm myself with a few of those terms because I binged on your work for the last week or two and prior to that, but more just trying to get ready for this episode to try to have a somewhat of a apprehension of what you're talking about. But yeah, I think if we can move into that social domain and do a comparative conversation about we're here, and what does this look like, and what does the transfer look like, and like you just said, how can science feel comfortable in the room with us if and again, I love the way you define love because I'm not a terribly emotive person. I might be sociopathic. I don't know. I struggle with that sometimes. I'm an empath. Like I can understand things outside of myself, and I joke about being sociopathic, but I'm not necessarily a gushy kind of person. But the way you just define love is to enter into vulnerability, and that or everything we talked about to be relational, I think is accessible to people, and it's not some new age conspiracy or some kind of let's all hug our unicorn dolls or whatever. It's more
Not that
if
there's
you want,
anything wrong with that.
you can hug your unicorn doll. That's fine. I got my cat over there. I'll give her a little hug. But no, it's to the idea that if we want to be paradoxical for a moment, it's for our survival. It's like I said earlier, we've kind of peaked out on our technological selves and maybe even our informational selves. Maybe we're flirting with quantum computing and machine learning and all these different things that may have interesting results, but we're so I like to use the analogy that with where we are right now with intelligence is if you built a drag racing vehicle and you had 1200 horsepower behind you and you had big tires and a good engine with gear ratios and things that'll get you 0 to 300 miles an hour, and you design this monster to race, and then you fire it up, but you didn't put brakes or steering wheel on it. That's the wisdom that needs to come in, and I think the
Mm.
steering might be some of that love that we're talking about. We've got a powerful engine going for us right now. Again, I joke that we're Homo technensis. We're not. I don't think we're sapient at all. We have flickers of it. We have sages that show up from time to time that we all kind of put aphorisms out there about them. But yeah, we need to take that more seriously. I think so. Anyway, to counter the sociopathy, and some of the other stuff that shows up in our culture that can ironically, again, lead to our demise on the model of fittedness and competition and all these things. It's counterproductive, I think, when it reaches a pinnacle of some kind. So anyway, that's
So
preachy, but
you were kind enough to arrange this conversation before the course, which I'm
yeah.
doing in a couple of weeks. Shall I say something in overview a little bit about, what's in and what's out of the scope of that? Would that be okay?
Could we please? And when I arranged in post-production the introduction monologue that I'll do, I'll put emphasis on that. I will have,
Well, that's kind of you. Thank you.
yeah, a means to get people where they need to go for this. But yes, please, if you could.
So the course is entitled The Love and the Music of Life, What Leads the Dance, the Evolution of Our Genes, or the Song in Our Heart. And there are 4 parts, 2 hours a week. And in the scope is to first of all talk about, where did the love go? How did our current understanding of the science of living systems remove love from the story, or turn it into love that's just business love, that I love you because you love me back, or
Right.
Love services the survival and reproductive interests of my genes, right?
Yeah.
That kind of love, not that kind of, where did the real love go, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Um, then in the second part, I'm talking about the where are the wobbly bits in our technical understanding of the framework we have so far, right? So why does the story that living systems are defined by their genes, and that the information to do that is put in the genes by natural selection, where does that story have wobbles and gaps, right? How do we, what's the evidence from the science of the biology and the evolution and the development of living systems that story is not the whole picture. Then in the third part, I'm going to talk about the territory of resonance, harmony, how systems communicate between scales, the cymatic stuff, where vibrations organize physical material, and how that kind of territory provides the possibility of cognition arising spontaneously from physics, basically. So that you don't need natural selection to bootstrap everything, that the natural processes of harmonic resonance create the right kind of dynamical interactions for systems to be cognitive spontaneously, and that's what a living system really is. And then in the fourth part, to try and connect that back to how does that help us regain the love, right? How does that help us move out of a mindset that's about optimization, dominance, control, and into a mindset that's more about relating, vulnerability, mutual interaction, a dance that we do with one another rather than walls that we build to protect ourselves. So that's the sort of territory that I'm aiming for. And the format is I'm going to try and, it's supposed to be open to everybody, so not to presume too much foreknowledge about the technical stuff.
Right.
And I'm going to do in each 2-hour session, 2 or 3 15-minute presentations, and leave a lot of room for discussion so that we can help people to understand and enter into a mutual, vulnerable, deeper knowing of one another, rather than just me sort of preaching some stuff I learned.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that'll have a better sort of currency to connect with people, especially a general audience. But I have to say it requires your attention. But everything that's on your channel, your what is it, 5 parts that you have discussing your thesis, it's accessible if you're interested and you've got some time in under your belt. You don't have to be a a postdoc or a PhD. I think or even a you can be kind of a dedicated average kind of person. There's gaps where I some of your stuff I have to stop and go, okay, what is he talking about there? But I think it's not too off-putting in that sense. But
Cool.
And again, for an uneducated person, but yeah, again, power down a little bit, and then engage, and then see where you're connecting, and then reciprocate with that.
Yeah.
Will have good effect. But yeah, I will again make sure that in post production of this, that I will emphasize
That's very
the
kind of you.
workshop
Thank
coming up.
you.
Yeah, yeah. No, I believe in what you're talking about, and I'm aligned with you in that sense that we've got to rethink some things, and we have to slow ourselves down a little bit. This rat race kind of thing that we're doing, is the ends. I think the writing is starting to show up a little bit, and we need to heed. It's like I said, you're building a drag racing vehicle with no brakes and no steering. And and we
But
hear.
even if you could steer it, who decided which way to point it? Right?
Yeah, yeah. And why
Like,
should it go so fast? You
yeah,
might
why
miss
is
something when
that?
you're doing 300.
Yeah, do you really think that when you get to the end of the drag race, you'll feel like you've achieved something? It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, where did you want to go? Right?
Yeah, right, right. So yeah, so we could milk that analogy and just say, hey, well, why are we building the drag racing machine again? Let's convert that horsepower into something that'll give us a broader perspective and beyond the linearity of the racetrack, and see a broader perspective. But yeah, however we want to say that, I think that wisdom, and it absolutely shatters me when I go on Twixter or X or whatever it is, and I see people saying we no longer need philosophy, we have science, and I'm like, what? That was a philosophical move, and you want to wait, what? Yeah, it's like that
Yeah.
kind of thinking doesn't scare me, but it bothers me
Yeah.
because it
Well,
speaks to this.
that's that Ian McGilchrist's writing on that is fantastic, I think, right?
Okay, okay, yeah.
The
Oh, the left brain, right brain thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right. So,
absolutely.
so the left brain is narrow focused, goal directed, and the
Yeah,
right brain is broad focused, more intuitive. And you need both. The right brain knows that you need both, and the left brain thinks the right brain is full of shit.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
The left brain thinks, no, I don't need intuition. I don't need a broader perspective. I'm doing this. I
Yeah,
already know
I'm
what the goal is.
analyzing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like, the broader perspective philosophy invents science. It's like, let's do objective measurement. And then the people doing science think, we don't need philosophy.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just, yeah, it's that same story at a different scale.
Yeah, yeah. So just those subtle tweaks and shifts, I think, in various tiers of, again, the psychosocial domain or whatever, the commons or whatever you want to call it, will do wonders to steering course correction, error correction, or updating of priors. We didn't even get into some of the Prestonian type of thinking. What we did, you did. I didn't bring up questions about that, which again we can handle in another conversation. And I guess we can also, if there are still people watching at this length, I might divide this into two parts, if I can edit, if I'm good enough at editing. But we will have maybe you and Matt Siegel get together
Yeah, that
for a
would be great.
conversation. I think that's just going to open up some terrain that'll be really fun to explore. So I'm looking forward to that. So Richard, is there anything else that you wanted to include in this conversation, or are we good?
Well,
Do you
you've
think
been very generous with your time. And thanks for making an arrangement with me on this short time scale to
Oh
do it.
yeah, I'll upload this tomorrow. So today's Thursday, the whatever second or third, and I'll make sure that or yeah, I guess it's the second. So we'll get this in tomorrow on the Friday the third, and that'll give it some time to get out into the space of social media and stuff like that, so that hopefully we can get some more people signed up and get into the course with you. But yeah, I will invite you back, and we can talk about maybe some structure for that one and in emails. And but anyway, to the YouTube audience, thank you all so much. It was an honor to have Richard here and to speak with him. It's enriched my compendium of conversations. So I appreciate that, Richard. And I'll
Thank
say
you very
goodbye to
much.
you after we stop record. So
I've enjoyed myself. Thank you.
awesome, awesome. All right, bye YouTube audience. Thank you.